They called me the stinky country girl in the one room I owned. It was a sharp, small thing, more hiss than sentence, murmured by a woman in a cocktail dress 2 tables over, the word ricocheting off crystal chandeliers and through the clink of champagne flutes. I had been in that ballroom 1,000 different times, once for inspections, later for hosting, later still for quiet breakfasts before sunrise. I knew the weight of the carpets, the precise burnish of the banister where centuries of elbows had rested, the way the afternoon light caught every speck of dust on the ballroom's gilded molding. On that evening, the light seemed to expose everything. Sloane's laugh folded into it like an insect. I felt it the way you feel wind before a storm, an inner tightening, a memory uncoiling. The phrase snapped me back to a younger version of myself, sleep-steeped, sticky with bleach, hands raw from scouring motel sinks at 4 a.m. The girl who had left our town with $200 in her pocket and the audacity to believe she could make something better. The girl who'd quietly paid the water bill when it was late, who'd signed for packages and tuition checks without a name attached, who'd kept the family alive through small, anonymous lifelines. Sloane and her friends thought they were sharp. They thought the joke was clever because it required no effort, just a toss of a slur into a circle of privileged noise. They had no idea who they were aiming at. They didn't know what the backstage smelled like, the late-night bleach and coffee that had been my life for a decade. They didn't know how I had learned to listen to other people's secrets, hotel staff, hoarders of grief, wedding planners at the end of their tether, and then turn those whispers into systems. They didn't know that when you build something from the ground up, you get very good at reading the room. I had chosen this place for Garrett's engagement because it was where he wanted it. Marble floors, a champagne fountain, his future mother-in-law's satin dress shimmering under the chandelier. He wanted to impress his fiancé's family, and in his mind that happened by reproducing their script. Expensive venue, curated guest list, private violinist, a speech that sounded like a bank statement. The irony wasn't lost on me. Do what they want, my mother used to say, as if the mold of belonging could be cast from a single shape. Garrett wanted the mold so badly he went and stepped into it. I watched Sloane adjust a strand of hair as if she were testing whether the room would approve her. That was when she leaned toward Delilah and said, without even the pretense of quiet, "Can you believe she's here? The stinky country girl? I thought she'd have the decency to stay home." The words, even diluted by gossip's law of diffusion, landed on my skin. My first instinct was not to pounce. Vengeance was cheap, and the ballroom was full of witnesses. My instinct, nurtured by years of cleaning up other people's messes, spilt wine, shattered glass, broken promises, was to catalog, to observe, to make records. My family didn't know I was here at first. Garrett had called a week before and told me, with that tone that always made me want to rescue him from himself, "Beth, Mom said on the Monarch, it's perfect." He had said it like a sales pitch, like the venue was another product he was endorsing, the concierge of his future married life. The Monarch had been a risk, a decade of sleepless ledgers and tempering my pride with the fire of necessity. I'd bought it when it was a morass of outdated wallpaper and leaking pipes, when the bank looked at my business plan and sent back a polite declination wrapped in numbers. I took that no and scrubbed the rooms until the hotel looked honest. I kept the old oak desk in the lobby because it reminded me of my grandmother. I hung a small photo of the house I grew up in behind the reception desk where only I ever saw it. Owning the place didn't come with a brass plaque that announced, "This room belongs to that person." Success doesn't always drum its arrival into a gathering. Many of the people in that ballroom had never set foot in my hotel until the invitation RSVP hit, some as buyers of the catering package, some as donors to the family celebration. Ownership is often invisible to those who only ever look for labels. That invisibility had advantages. People underestimated me the way you underestimated low tide, but it also had cost. Emotional tolls I had built into my chest like shingles over exposed wood. My mother still called Garrett the good son in public, as if my years of late shifts and late payments were tentative experiments rather than a continuous ledger of labor. I'd put my hand over her fumble in the cable bill once, twice, a dozen times. I had wired money privately for medical tests she pretended were unnecessary. I had done it because love isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet direct deposit at 2 a.m. There are universes where I walked in, heard the insult, and walked out. But it's not the endearing, dignified origin story people like to post about, a woman of principle who refuses degradation. In every version, what happened next was more complicated. For me, it was a small observation followed by a sequence of hunches, the way a detective might notice the same mud on 2 different shoes, and begin to connect the footprints. First, there were the micro-mistakes the Whitmores made. Small things, but consistent. A pointless argument over dessert etiquette that revealed a lack of deep knowledge about the event's vendor list. Franklin's phone lowering away from the group whenever someone asked him a direct question about his business.
Delilah folding and refolding a handkerchief with a nervousness that wasn't anxiety at their daughter's engagement, but performance anxiety. People too practiced at playing rich to trust their own acts.
Sloane's eyes, hungry and unanchored, moved across the room like someone hoping to find a treasure map pinned to a guest's coat. On the surface, they had the look: tailored suits, pearls, a confidence that smoothed their conversation like solvent. On closer look, their speech was all surface. Phrases like family funds, portfolio, legacy, thrown like confetti, but never backed by practical, boring things like tangible invoices, verifiable properties, or business licenses and research I ran once I got home that night. The Whitmore's social performance had the same thing every confidence game has: great lighting, no receipts. The thing about suspicious people is they make mistakes at home. They leave paper trails because their lives are built on improvisation. They assume the next person is performing a role, an audience that will be deceived by choreography. That arrogance is their Achilles heel. I don't pretend to be Sherlock Holmes. I had no ambition for glory. My first move was practical and small. I asked Wesley, my general manager, and the man who'd been with me since we opened the Monarch's doors, to keep an eye. Wesley has the steady patience of someone who has watched leaky boilers and sour reviews with equal composure. He knows the hotel the way a farmer knows a field. He can read a guest ledger the way others read tea leaves. At the engagement, Wesley came to the corner where I stood by the dessert table. He brought me a napkin and a look that was half apology, half information. "Franklin's been on the phone a lot," he said, quietly, so it would sound like casual business. And he hesitated. Patrons asked about donations. One guest mentioned they'd received a promise of investment opportunities, but never a follow-up. It was the kind of thing that could mean nothing. It was also the kind of thing that, given Sloane's idle cruelty, had weight. My internal ledger ticked. Note suspicious pattern, check family background, confirm. I stood there for a minute with a glass of champagne in my hand that tasted like someone else's expectation, and I thought of all the small, quiet ways I'd been kind to the people in that room. A dozen anonymous transfers to help a crooked landlord pay for a heater, a discreet text to a cousin about an overdue rent, meals left on the porch of my mother's friend during winter. You don't tell people when you step in, because that erases the dignity they already feel when someone else thinks them worthy. You do it because the people you love sometimes need you to. After the engagement party, once the guests had gone and the bats of light had retreated from the chandeliers, Wesley slipped me a manila folder while we did the round of the cleaning crew. Inside were copies of receipts, a note about Franklin's phone number appearing on a vendor's suspicious list, and, remarkably, a photograph, torn, grainy, of a woman with a profile that sent my mouth dry.
It was Sloane, but the photo had an older caption: Sandra Williams, Arizona case. Wesley had found it in an online discussion forum that collated reports of fraud, places where victims told their stories. He wasn't the sort to go down internet rabbit holes for sport. He had done it because the conversation in the ballroom had lodged a splinter of discomfort beneath his nails. I'd already been running 2 lives for years: the person who opens the doors at dawn, sweeps the lobbies, makes the cold calls, and the woman who carries small envelopes of cash and silence to keep a family afloat. That anonymous support had always felt like a private ledger of love. It didn't occur to me that the ledger had a weak spot until I saw the necklace. My grandmother's necklace was a piece of junk to everyone else, a thin gold chain with a tiny locket that had scratched from years of being handled. To me, it was a touchstone. It smelled faintly of my grandmother's perfume and of my childhood. She had worn it in church and at bingo nights when she laughed until her teeth, what little had been left, glinted. I remembered it as a thing she fastened around my throat once when I was small, saying, "Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth, Bets." It was the sort of phrase that seems small until it becomes your scaffolding. I learned at the party that my mother had handed that necklace to Sloane as a gift. I was not in the room when it happened. I saw the photograph later. Patricia smiling, her arms wrapped around a slipper satin sleeve. The photograph was a cut in my chest. It was not the necklace itself that stunned me. Objects can be replaced, sentimentally if not materially. It was the realization that my mother, the woman I had protected so quietly, had been so taken by a story that she mistook the actor for the role she wanted things to occupy. People who live performed lives give away what they think will buy them belonging. My mother had been starved for status for so long that when someone polished a mirror for her and presented her with the reflection of acceptance, she reached for it. The necklace wasn't the crime, it was the symbol, the fragile thing that represented our history, handed to a stranger whose name didn't belong behind it. That photograph, the folder, Wesley's tone, these things stitched together like a seam. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the folder in front of me. Outside, the city hummed with other people's futures.
I wouldn't have liked a dramatic confrontation. I didn't want to shatter my mother's illusions in front of our family, to be the loud voice that breaks a plate to prove a point. My whole life had taught me that the loud consistencies of living, powdered milk on the shelf, a heater fixed, a gas bill paid, meant more than a public show of righteousness.
So I did what I always do when faced with a problem that could take either the easy, reactive route or the patient, surgical one. I called people who could help me read the handwriting. When I met Naomi, she took one look at the folder and frowned. A small, efficient frown. "This could be nothing," she said, because she had to be honest. "But there's a pattern. Layering, movement between shell accounts, promises of returns without corresponding cash flow. It looks Ponzi-ish." Naomi's office smelled like coffee and legal pads. She worked with Rebecca Thornton, the lawyer I had used once before to untangle a messy vendor contract. Rebecca is the kind of lawyer who doesn't make speeches, but makes paperwork do the heavy lifting. She has patience for forms and a soft moral outrage about people who take from others. Together, they were a calm center for a problem that otherwise felt like a kettle on the boil. We began to build a map. Naomi dug through bank records she'd obtained lawfully, requests through proper channels, subpoenas when necessary. She connected Franklin Whitmore's name to a series of shell corporations with little apparent revenue, but lots of transfers labeled vague things: consulting fees, market research, family offices. Money sloshed from one entity to another, then evaporated. She found payments routed through third-party vendors that were registered under names that didn't match the people on the guest list. When Naomi showed me a spreadsheet with highlighted red boxes, I felt the old feeling, seeing something tidy where most people only saw chaos. Rebecca took the legal posture. She made calls, arranged meetings, asked the right questions about chain of custody, about what would be needed to make a public claim without risking defamation. She wasn't there to indulge my desire for dramatic justice. She was there to ensure any action taken would be defensible. "If you expose them publicly without proper confirmation," she said, "you could be accused of libel. Or worse, you could ruin a family if your facts are shaky. We need documents, not gossip." It was what I wanted to hear and what I could barely swallow. There is a primitive part of you that wants to see an immediate ripple, someone apologizing at the foot of your shoes. But justice, Rebecca reminded me, is more often a meticulous stacking of documents and a patient that looks like an action. We followed the breadcrumb trail to an alias. Naomi's research flagged that the name Sandra Williams had come up in a small Arizona case 5 years prior, an identity tied to false investment schemes. The photograph in Wesley's folder matched the woman in the Arizona filing. The more we looked, the more matches appeared. Similar business names, overlapping email addresses, the odd recycled P.O. box. With each connection, Naomi lit a small lantern. Not fireworks, but sunlight through a crack. "You're not imagining it," Naomi said one afternoon, when all the world outside my office window seemed like it had been designed to distract. "These are classic patterns, but it's not definitive yet." That note was important. The difference between suspicion and proof is heavy and concrete. I didn't want to be the person who piled shame on shadows, but I also couldn't ignore the way Garrett looked at Sloane when she smiled, like a man who had never been dared to ask whether what he believed had roots. He was the golden child only in the stories my mother told. He had never had to ask hard questions. If this was a show, he was the willing understudy. I told Naomi and Rebecca everything I knew about the anonymous transfers to the family. I confessed that I had been the safety net, that I had been paying certain bills, and that the money had come from legitimate profits of the monarch. The knowledge that I had been a secret benefactor made the situation more urgent. If these people were con artists, they were playing at the edge of my family's vulnerability, and if they were, their scheme could extend beyond my brother and mother. We agreed on a course of action that preserved the law and aimed to protect the people I loved. We would build an airtight case: bank records, screenshots, vendor confirmations, copies of documents that demonstrated the ring of falsehood. We would present it to the proper authorities before making any public exposure. Rebecca would file motions to obtain additional records where necessary. Naomi would assemble the accounting chain, and I would continue to observe, to gather the small inconsistencies that only an owner-operator could notice. If there was a danger, we wanted it neutralized by professionals. I also told Wesley to be ready to secure any physical evidence in the event of a lawful investigation. He understood chain of custody in a way that made my fingers relax. He knew what to freeze on cameras, what logs to preserve. And then there was the moral calculus. To expose them in this ballroom would humiliate my mother in front of the world. To allow them to proceed would risk my brother losing his savings, his reputation, and possibly something deeper, the part of him that still believed that people were what they pretended to be. The problem had two solutions: protect family and let them learn the hard way, or expose immediately and risk fracturing what was left. I kept choosing the more surgical of the two, even when my chest beat with the desire to rend fabric. At night, I replayed Sloane's laugh. I remembered her hands as she unfastened the old necklace around my mother's throat. I let myself feel the sting, but did not let it harden into something I couldn't wear again. This is the quiet work of someone who has learned that anger without aim is only wind. We began our slow, bureaucratic crawl toward truth. Naomi obtained archival records legally. She identified patterns of payments, small amounts moved between accounts and then consolidated into one. Rebecca prepared letters to vendors and service providers asking for copies of invoices. Wesley pulled surveillance footage to ensure we had a time-stamped account of who came into which room throughout the engagement. I called Garrett under the guise of brotherly concern and asked innocent-seeming questions about the Whitmore's businesses. He answered with the sort of blithe confidence that made my chest ache. "Franklin's family has a lot of holdings," he said. "They're very private, Beth. People like private." That was the heart of it. People like private. Privacy is a mask that can be worn to protect the vulnerable or to conceal predators. The difference lies in transparency, when someone asks for documentation, in the kind of people who offer proof instead of pedestals. Garrett had believed in the pedestal. He still did. And in his worldview, a pedigree was an inheritance as much as money was. He had never had to ask for a pedigree he couldn't get. Meanwhile, Sloane did something that made my skin crawl. She started to show a fascination with the monarch's back rooms. She would linger near the staff entrance and ask perfunctory questions about hotel staff and future bookings, as if she were marking territory. I don't think she was thinking strategically. Greedy people often misinterpret the signs of their own collapse as opportunity. She assumed that an owner who kept her head down would never wield the levers she needed. It was a miscalculation born of arrogance. The deeper we dug, the more the pattern emerged. A house of cards, propped up by necessary illusions. There were transfers that read like a magician's trick. Money moved in circles, commitments to payouts that relied on new investors trickling in. We weren't the first to notice such a pattern. Naomi traced similar signatures to previous cases. Rebecca started to whisper procedural language into my life. Depositions, subpoenas, the patience of the courtroom. It is in those whispering moments, that clean legal language, that anger morphs into purpose. I could feel a plan taking a shape that didn't belong to malice, to shield my family, to protect our investors, to preserve the monarch's integrity. I had wealth now in the form that mattered to me, a place of work for others, a source of dignity for the staff who had become my people. The idea of letting it be a place of deceit sat like a stone in my throat. I told myself, and Naomi and Rebecca and Wesley, that if we were going to make a scene, it would be for the right reasons. Not to humiliate, but to prevent harm. Not to gloat, but to assert truth.
I kept imagining my grandmother's voice, "Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth." And I realized the phrase had two edges, a shield against others' words, and a responsibility to act when those words become weapons that hurt the people you love. We didn't move quickly in the way the drama of a movie suggests. There were legal forms, lockboxes, requests that took weeks, and the tedious, meticulous assembling of small items into a pattern. When Naomi presented me with an annotated timeline, emails, payments, photographs, my heart tightened, not with the desire for revenge, but with the recognition that we had built something credible. Rebecca advised caution. "We take it to an agent," she said, "a federal agent. This is beyond civil claims if they are defrauding investors." That is where Agent Carla Reeves entered the constellation. Carla wasn't cinematic, she was matter-of-fact, with a voice like a librarian who had seen too many books burned. When Rebecca explained the pattern, Carla listened, asked questions, and ordered the file. She didn't make promises beyond process. There is a moral grace in that steadiness. She told us what would be needed to bring this to a place where a warrant could be sought, where arrests could be made by people with badges and paperwork, not by someone with an audience and an iron taste for spectacle. Working with Carla meant we waited for the right moment, when there was enough evidence for the authorities to intervene. It was both frustrating and oddly comforting. For me, the waiting was a lesson in tempering theatrical satisfaction with the law's slow rhythm. I had fantasized about turning on the ballroom screens mid-toast and forcing a truth into people's faces, but Rebecca and Carla and Naomi kept me honest. Law is the blade that cuts clean. Spectacle is a blunt instrument. As we assembled proof, the accounts, the emails, the vendor confirmations, I felt the scale of what I had done for my family become visible. I had been anonymous to preserve people's dignity, and that anonymity had, in a way, permitted their vulnerability. To expose the Whitmores publicly would also expose the fact that my family had accepted help from a ghost. That could be embarrassing, it could be healing. The choice wasn't about pride, it was about safety. I made a decision then, one that was practical and painful. I would reveal the truth in a way that protected my family, not humiliating them, but returning to them the agency to face the fallout privately if they chose. If that meant I had to step forward and claim ownership in public, even in a way that would sting their egos, I would. I would do it because it was necessary.
We planned the logistics and low-voiced meetings in the Monarch's back office and in Naomi's windowless conference room. We'll need the audiovisual logs, Rebecca said. We'll need the guest ledger. We'll need to freeze the bookings that were linked with suspicious payments.
We'll arrange a time to present this to Carla formally. Naomi would label each document. Wesley would ensure the hotel systems preserved all relevant footage. I considered, for the first time in a long while, taking center stage. Not for the applause, for the truth. When I told Garrett I was closing the Monarch for a private family day to handle some administrative things, his response was polite and a little bored. It was comforting to know that he still assumed I was doing what he had always expected, keeping the business running so he could step into it when he needed. I didn't want to tell him everything. I wanted to give him the chance to absorb the fact of things, rather than be browbeaten into shame in front of people who had no right to it. My mother's response when I confronted her about the necklace was a small, messy thing. She cried, not for the loss of an object, but because she had believed herself accepted. They were kind to me, she said, which is both true and tragically incomplete. Kindness given in exchange for a performance is still hunger. I told her the facts gently. I didn't make an accusation. I offered evidence and the promise of a path forward. She agreed to let me handle things. It was not a triumph. It was a beginning. We moved carefully. Carla's agents requested additional documents. Naomi compiled them. Rebecca prepared motions. Wesley preserved footage that showed Franklin leaving the ballroom alone for long stretches, making calls in the service stairwell. The staff were coached to be discreet. They had become my allies in a way that made me ache with gratitude. For people who had been paid wages below dignity not long before the Monarch's renovation, we had built something that respected them. Fair shifts, benefits, a real schedule. They had, collectively, learned to trust me in a way that wasn't transactional. That trust felt like currency. I won't lie. There were nights when the desire to make Sloane suffer was a small, delicious itch. I am not immune to human vanity, but the story's moral architecture I had been taught by my grandmother, by the empty-handed kindness of the places I had worked, required restraint. My goal was not to humiliate, but to secure. It took a kind of courage to choose to step into the light, not to blind others, but to let them see clearly. The plan took shape. When there was legally sufficient evidence, we would coordinate with Agent Reeves to make sure the appropriate legal process would follow. My role would be to ensure the Monarch's records and the evidence Naomi had gathered were presented intact. Rebecca would manage the legal front, Wesley would manage the staff, and I would be the person who, if needed, could tell the story of why the evidence mattered in human terms, because the person whose savings were at risk was my brother, and the people whose dignity had been traded were my family.
There is an oddly unromantic moment in any plan where you realize the rest is administrative. We sat in the Monarch's conference room and went through the binders. I traced my finger over the stapled documents. Somewhere between the invoices and the emails and the bank statements, the narrative of deception became a dry, awful machine. I felt calmer. Anger had leached into purpose. And yet, even as we prepared the legal steps, I couldn't stop thinking about that whisper, "Stinky country girl." Words matter because they mark territory. Those words had been intended to belittle and push me out of the story. They had attempted to erase the work of someone who had borne 1,000 small indignities with a kind of stubbornness that is not romantic but necessary. I decided, quietly, that I would not let them make the space in which we kept our dignity into something they owned. With Rebecca's guidance, we arranged for Agent Reeves to be at the ready once we had the final records. We had no intention of staging anything. There was a difference in my head between being dramatic and being theatrical. We chose the former because the law will not bend to the latter. Still, the idea niggled. The people who had mocked me would be forced to confront the truth. It felt like turning the tide. We rehearsed in the quiet way people rehearse for practical things, responses that wouldn't escalate, ways to present documents so they would be seen, not shouting. I thought about the cameras in the ballroom. I thought about the staff and their lives. I thought about my brother's smile when he shouldn't be smiling, and how fragile people are when they're wrapped in illusions. Even as we prepared, Garrett was still blissfully convinced of his future. He introduced Sloane to a friend of mine as an incredible person with tenacity, and the friend smiled and said the right things. I felt an old, complex disappointment. He had always been my golden brother in the way family hands out roles, but bronze is sometimes more enduring than gold. My brother had never understood how a room could be owned without being flaunted. When the day came that Carla said she had probable cause to proceed, I felt both an adrenaline buzz and the gentle, almost grief of something finished. We had done it the way Rebecca insisted, legally, patiently, and with attention to the people who would be affected. But there was still the immediate cost. The Whitmores were going to have to be confronted in a public forum. My mother would have to reconcile with the fact that she'd been deceived. Garrett would have to decide whether to stand by or stand apart. The night before any public action, I walked the Monarch alone. The house was sleeping. I ran my fingers along the banister where guests had leaned. I imagined my grandmother's small hands fitting into mine. I said, without religious flourish, because I'm not a person of big religious things, just plainly, keep us steady. Sometimes we make unlikely vows. Sometimes we make them with resolve. Mine, then, was for the people who worked at the Monarch, and for the family who didn't know how much they had been sustained by someone they called a lesser child. It was for the dignity of truth, and for the small, stubborn work of making things right. And then there was the last tactical piece. I am an owner who understands how a venue can be used. I know where the AV closet hides, how the projection switch is triggered, which screens are seen by who. Wesley and I made a plan, not a spectacle, to ensure that if the moment came to present documents to a room, documents that had been verified by Naomi and reviewed by Rebecca and accepted by Agent Reeves, there would be no way for the evidence to be dismissed as rumor. We took the time to make sure the files could be displayed, legibly, in a way that made the pattern clear without being theatrical about it. There is a lesser kind of power in owning the place where people gather. It's not just in the deeds and the bank accounts. It's in knowing the exit routes, the location of the microphones, the way the light hits a face at 7 minutes past 8. Owning a room means you can set a table. It also means you can set the terms of a conversation. For reasons Rebecca, Naomi, and Carla all agreed on, we would not act publicly without the agents in place. That too with a moral line. No one would be dragged in the street by people who felt slighted. The law would do its weighty work. So we prepared. Wesley walked the staff through their roles in a way that never once suggested they would be part of a public spectacle. Naomi reviewed the highlights so that, should evidence need to be shown, the narrative would be tight and digestible. Rebecca filed the final evidence package with the investigators. Agent Reeves promised discretion and law. I practiced being the proprietor who had to tell a truth that would hurt people I loved. When I entered the ballroom on the day everything was meant to happen, I pulled on my boots. That sounds strangely prosaic, boots at a ballroom, but the boots are a small anchor to who I am. They are the thing that ties me to the person who once spent nights ironing sheets in a motel, to the woman who built a hotel not for glory but for keeping people decent rooms. I stood in the back of the room, watched Sloane fuss with cufflinks, watched Delilah chatter about future philanthropic events she had, watched Franklin check his watch like a man who had appointments he hadn't yet manufactured. I could feel the room breathing. The guests arranged themselves like birds on a wire, some comfortable, some nervous, all arranging their faces in the way of social appearances. My heart beat not with rage, but with a calm focus. This moment was not for me. It belonged to the people who would need the truth to survive a potential financial injury.
I felt the chain of responsibility, my grandmother's words, my years of labor, my staff's trust, and realized that it had at last congealed into action. Wesley tapped my shoulder, and I nodded. The AV console hummed to life. The screens were ready with files that Naomi had prepared, files that Rebecca had signed off on. Agent Reeves sat at the side table with her team, their presence in affirmation that this was not a personal vendetta, but a legal proceeding in waiting. I took a breath that tasted like irony. The same room that had been chosen to flaunt a future would, if necessary, be the place where truth would anchor that future in reality. And yet, even as my fingers hovered near the switch, my mind returned, as it always did, to the small things: my grandmother's laughter, my mother's hands, Garrett's smile. We were about to do something that could fracture everything, or save it. The tension was not theatrical, it was real, like the coaxing of a wound to heal rather than to scar. As I stepped toward the back of the room, the music swelled, a violinist's soft roll that had been tuned to the expectation of celebration. I felt, for the briefest of seconds, the pull of being the woman who could ruin a party with a single click. The thought of it was intoxicating and dangerous. I remembered Naomi's spreadsheet, Rebecca's caution, Carla's steady face. My hand met the edge of the console. The screen breathed, a pale light like dawn. I did not press the button. I stood there, rooted by a mix of rage, love, and the mathematical certainty that truth presented in a quiet, factual way had the best chance to repair more than it broke. Behind me, Garrett laughed at a joke Sloane made. I felt a swell of something like sorrow. He had always been loved for wearing the parts of himself that people respected. He had never learned to unbutton his own assumptions. I waited. The room held its shape, like a tide at the edge of a tide pool. Somewhere down the table, Delilah smoothed her dress. Franklin checked the guest book. Sloane's smile was a little too wide, as though she sensed the possibility of getting more than she'd been given. I inhaled, and the air smelled of cut flowers and the particular metallic tang of imminent consequence. I thought of my grandmother's necklace and the small corroded clasp I had loved.
I thought of the anonymous texts I had used to keep the heat on and the radiator working in a January that had once been too cold in her house. I thought of Naomi, of Rebecca, of Carla and Wesley, and of the small, stubborn staff whose lives I had quietly tried to make better. And then, as if a single universe had decided to make the moment electric with the possibility of truth, Franklin rose to speak. He lifted his glass, words poised like a bird at the edge of flight. I felt the prickle along my scalp. Not malicious, not triumphant, just the precise human reaction to standing at a hinge.
Everything we'd done had been careful, lawful, accountable. The truth was ready to be shown. The room still had no idea who owned it. I pressed my fingers to the console and felt the cool plastic under my knuckles. The music softened, and he began to speak. He lifted his glass and spoke like a man practicing warmth. To Gareth and Sloane, may your lives be as abundant as your love. His smile wanted to be ointment. The room obliged with applause the way a machine trained to produce applause does. There was a small private signal across the AV booth. A row of heads bent, a single flicker of a hand toward me. Naomi's highlighted spreadsheet was on the screen in front of me. Rebecca's legal cover letter sat like a talisman at my elbow, and Agent Reeves sat stone still with that librarian's patience that had carried us so far. I felt the inevitable click of consequence somewhere in my ribs. If you like these kinds of true-to-life stories, go ahead and subscribe. It keeps more stories like this coming. I heard the faint intake of a breath behind me, and then the hush in the room as Franklin's words tapered. I pressed the button. Light spilled into the chandeliers and then folded itself across the screens. What came up first was a single photograph. Sandra Williams, captioned with the Arizona filing Naomi had flagged. The letters were clear. Previous complaints, false investment schemes. A low murmur threaded through the guests. Someone's fork clattered. The violinist faltered as if a note had been scissored out. We had made the presentation with care. Naomi had annotated the timeline so the human eye could follow money as if it were walking down a hallway. Dates, accounts, tiny red boxes around suspicious transfers. Rebecca had insisted on legible fonts, simple callouts, see page 3, so no one could smear the work as melodrama. The first slide was a bridge from allegation to question. This woman appears in prior filings. Please see attached documents. My fingers hovered over the console but did not tremble. The room translated the images into a language it understood. Proof. There were screenshots of emails promising returns, invoices that bore vendor names that didn't match, and a spreadsheet Naomi had turned into something like a crime scene map. Arrows, highlights, dots that connected into a pattern. We had even included a bank statement with text blurred except for the key transfers, labeled Family Office Disbursement, that wired into accounts with no operating businesses. Each document was anchored with source citations that Rebecca had verified. A hand near the front, Delilah's I thought, went to her throat. Franklin's face went from comfortable color to a blanch that made him look new and brittle. Sloane's smile flickered, then dropped. Her lips mouthed a denial that was swallowed by the sound of someone whispering, "This can't be real," as if refusing a document could make the ink evaporate.
Agent Reeves rose from her seat with the quiet efficiency of someone who does not need spectacle to prove resolve. "These documents were submitted to our office by counsel," she said, voice firm without flourish. "We have probable cause to initiate an investigation into alleged fraud and related financial crimes. We are exercising our authority to detain persons of interest while we secure additional records." Her words landed like an anchor. The room, which had been a living thing of dress silk and polite teeth, drew in like a mouth closing. No one was dragged into the aisles. No one was humiliated with shouted accusations. The agents in the corner closed the circle with practiced calm. That is the point where law is most beautiful. It moves to do its job and lets the rest, shock, shame, apology, happen under its umbrella. Franklin rose, suddenly small on the dais. For a moment I saw a man imagining the many rooms his performance had bought him. Country clubs, a sense of lineage, a future that would not require a second thought about what he ate or where he slept. That posture evaporated. He tried to speak, something about misunderstandings and a mistake, but the terms we're taught to use when we hope to soften an impact were useless here. The documents on the screen were not softened by his voice. Sloane moved fast, too fast for a socialite learning to act shocked. She lunged past a buffet table, a practiced glide that read to my eyes like a woman looking for an exit rather than a rescue. An agent stepped in front of her, blocking the path with the gentleness of someone who does this work to protect more than to punish. I did not move toward them. I had no right and no need to. The situation belonged to Carla and her team now. It could have been a brutal scene. It was not. Agents explained in clipped words the procedure. They asked Sloane to come with them to answer questions. She kept shouting about misunderstanding, about being set up, about her reputation.
Her voice grew higher and less persuasive as it became clear that the sound it made could not fold back into the room and make the papers untrue. A young officer, too young for this sort of thing, kept his hands calm at his sides. He read her the rights, she cried. She flailed when the metal bolted around her wrist. The reaction was human but subdued, the way a person who has been caught in a lie collapses under the weight of their own choreography. Delilah began to sob, a high, unsteady sound that made a few people shift in their seats as if to find a polite distance from the wreckage. Franklin looked narrower than he'd appeared any hour before. The smile he'd practiced for years had been mostly a prop, there to smooth the edges of conversations and hide the absence of ledgers.
He tried to steady himself with a speech about intended investments and promising futures, but the slides on the screen moved on to show emailed promises that had never been fulfilled, contract names that had no business listing, and the flow of money that evaporated into shell companies Naomi had traced. Someone in the back whispered, Ponzi. The word landed like an accusation, and not just at the Whitmores. It landed on the idea that polish equals reality. People had invested not because they had evidence, but because they wanted to be part of something that looked wealthy. That willingness to be convinced by a costume had been their vulnerability. Agents took depositions later on. In that ballroom, they used handcuffs and careful phrases. There was no shouting from me, no triumphant applause. That would have been cheap. Instead, there was a hush, stamped and heavy, like a lid. Later, when questioned by reporters, Agent Reeves said the charges would be determined by ongoing investigation, and that due process would follow. I prefer it that way. Justice without haste, truth without cruelty. When it was over and the agents had led the Whitmores toward a quiet exit with minimal spectacle, the room did not instantly feel healed. People stood like stunned birds. The violinist lowered his bow and then resumed, fragile music filling in the gaps as people tried to recompose what they'd come to celebrate. Garrett had not yet left. He was on his feet, colorless, moving toward where the agents had been moments before, like a man following a thread he had just noticed was frayed. He turned to me then. No grand gesture, no dramatic accusation, only the small, terrible clarity of a brother realizing that he had been wrong. His voice was thin when he said, Beth, I didn't know. There are 1,000 ways to say I was wrong, and most of them are clumsy. I had rehearsed a speech in my head 1,000 times, equal parts accusation and explanation, but he did not need a lecture. He needed to know what had happened and where we stood. He needed to hear the truth without the theater. You did this to protect us, he said, a sentence that was not congratulation but recognition. Why didn't you tell me? Because telling you would have cost you the easiest version of your life, I thought, but did not say. Instead, I offered the honest, quieter truth. I didn't tell you because you wouldn't have listened until your life was threatened. I didn't tell Mom because she wanted to believe and she deserved to be protected. I did it because this place is a livelihood for a lot of people and I could see the way they were being used. He reached for me, a clumsy attempt at comfort that was at once immediate and tender. We stood, 2 siblings in a room that had been both stage and courtroom that night, and there was no show on either of our faces. There was only the plainness of family, messy and human, finally up for inspection.
My mother sat at the table, fingers entwined with the satin of her dress, and when I walked over, she looked up, as if realizing in a fresh way that the world had rewritten its margins. Her face was tender with grief and with dull shock. I thought, she began, but the sentence crumpled like tissue. I took the necklace from the small velvet box that had been found in Sloane's clutch by an attentive hotel attendant, a detail Wesley had handled with all the delicacy of someone who knows how to preserve dignity. There are moments when an object is more than metal. It holds a voice, a smell, a gravity. I unhooked it from its paper like it was an actor's prop and held it out to her without ceremony. Patricia's hands hovered over the chain, then closed. I thought she loved me, she said. Not an excuse, but a longing. The admission was honest and small, and it broke something in me that was not about theft, but about our fragile hunger for acceptance. I could have taken harsh delight in offering the necklace back with a rebuke, but there was no virtue in that cruelty. So I let the chain rest in her palm. She looked up at me, and for the first time in a long time, saw me not as the lesser child, but as someone who had been keeping things together. Her eyes filled, not with triumph, but with apology. I'm sorry, she said, and the words were raw, not practiced. I wanted to believe. I didn't think. You were lonely, I finished, because sometimes naming the ache is the thing that lets a person begin to heal. Her tears were not for the object, but for the idea that she had given away a part of our past for a reflection in someone else's mirror. She pressed the necklace back into my hand. You keep it, she said. You always knew. I accepted it without protest. It felt right that my grandmother's locket should wear my neck again, but more than that, it felt right that the small talismans of our family were not pawned off for acceptance.
Garrett's apology came in pieces over the next few days as the story leaked into the city like water finding a floorboard's crack. People are rarely simple in remorse. They are messy cocktails of regret and shame and self-preservation. He told me in a voice that wanted to be strong. I was a fool. I loved the idea of being wanted by people who looked like power, and I didn't ask for receipts. You loved the idea of being validated without work, I said. It was not accusation so much as diagnosis. He flinched, but did not argue. The truth can be a map to a better place if you let it be one. The Whitmores were processed and charged with multiple counts. Allegations of fraud, wire transfers inconsistent with corporate activity, solicitation under false pretenses. Agent Reeves's team did their job. There were subsequent subpoenas, depositions, and a long, messy legal season that I chose not to make the center of my life.
I had a hotel to tend, a staff who had watched their workplace become a courtroom, and a family that needed tending in ways that were quieter than headlines. There was media, of course. A discreet pool camera had filmed the agent's entrance. The internet had opinions, as it always does. I refused interviews that would have turned the narrative into spectacle. Rebecca counseled against it, Naomi nodded in agreement, and Wesley reminded me that our staff deserved privacy. There would be time later to explain on my own terms what had happened. For now, the priority was people who had been hurt. One of those people was Nicole Patterson, a young woman who had worked at the Monarch as a server during college, and whose scholarship application I had read alone at night, the way parents read their children's schoolwork. I had started a small fund in my grandmother's name the year after the Monarch reopened, money for someone who showed grit instead of pedigree. It was the kind of thing that felt right to do quietly. Nicole was the first recipient. When she came into the Monarch for a scholarship breakfast a few weeks later, she sat across from me and looked around at the chandelier and then at me with a steadiness that made me ache. "I don't know what you saw in me," she said, voice small and direct. "What I saw," I replied, "was someone who showed up." I told her the truth, the kind of truth that is not press release but guidance. Show up, be competent, keep your integrity. She laughed, half crying, half breathless. "Thank you for believing when nobody called me brilliant," she said, and for a moment I saw my grandmother's small hands again. We made a small ceremony not for television crews but for our staff. Nicole spoke about how the scholarship would change her ability to finish nursing school, and a few of the housekeeping staff wept openly during her speech. It was the opposite of spectacle. It was a community braiding itself together. That felt like victory to me. My mother began therapy soon after. It was the kind of slow, steady work that does not look good on a timeline but is effective in its own way. She learned to separate the hunger for acceptance from the facts of reality. It was awkward at times. Old habits of seeking status are not easily broken, but there was progress. She apologized to me publicly in family circles, and privately in a voice that trembled. I accepted the apologies with the cautious grace of someone who has learned that forgiveness is a process, not a single act. Garrett cleaned up his own life in fits and starts. He moved out of his fiancé's apartment before the divorce was even fully discussed, which is to say he moved into a life that required work. He started attending small business classes with Wesley, who indulged him and then made him do the hard things. Balance sheets, vendor meetings, staff check-ins. It was the sort of humility that comes when you stop performing and begin contributing. The Whitmores' legal case took months to unspool. We complied with subpoenas. I met with Agent Reeves a handful of times to make sure our documentation was complete. Naomi testified in chambers about patterns of transfers she had identified, always careful to be factual rather than theatrical. Rebecca managed the legal front lines with the unglamorous clarity of someone who knows that paperwork is often where justice is made. There were motions and counters and a few dramatic hearings that made the local news, but there were also long stretches of being grouped with other cases in the federal system, where time grinds like a patient mill. There were moments in the months after when a cruel voice inside me wanted to relish the fall of people who had sneered at me. I felt the tug of that satisfaction and then intentionally pushed it away. Retribution tastes fine for a minute and then leaves you hungrier. I had chosen to do this to protect people, not to feed my ego. So I did the less satisfying but richer work, rebuilding trust, ensuring restitution where it was possible, and making sure that the Monarch remained a place of dignity for the staff who had been caught up in the spectacle. The hotel recovered its bookings, slowly. Some clients canceled, others called to express appreciation for how we handled the situation. A few donors who had previously been checked by the Whitmores reached out to assist patrons they believed had been harmed. Somehow in that messy aftermath, community reorganized. Perhaps it was one of the unseen benefits of being an owner. You can use the access of your position to knit things back together. There were small moments that mattered more than press coverage. A housekeeper who had been with us since before the renovation received a small bonus I could afford because the Monarch had stayed solvent through the ordeal.
Wesley and I instituted a staff emergency fund because we had seen what fragile security looked like in other people's lives and did not want our people to be put in that position again. Naomi helped us formalize a system for vendor vetting, simple, practical measures, so no scammer with a polished smile could slip through the way the Whitmores had. People asked if I felt vindicated. Vindication is a strange thing. The papers had been shown, charges had been made, the law was moving. But vindication is a headline. What I felt was steadiness. Having built the monarch with my hands and my ledger, having protected my people, and having kept the legal path clean, that steadiness was a softer, stronger satisfaction than any explosive moment of gloating could have given me. There was a private moment between me and Garrett one afternoon in the hotel garden when autumn was starting to throw its dry confetti across the lawn. He looked at me as if measuring how much to trust again. "You saved me," he said, the words awkward with gratitude. And he stopped, searching for the humility he needed.
I didn't know what it meant to look at someone else's work and respect it. I thought generosity was flashy. "It isn't," I said. "It's the late night you didn't know about. It's the bills paid so someone could sleep easier. It's the person who takes the heat so other people don't have to." He nodded, and for the first time in years, we had a conversation that wasn't about roles handed down by habit. It was family by choice. Months later, after the legal system had started to move toward arraignments and the Whitmores faced formal charges, I gave a short private talk in the Monarch's small event room to a group of young entrepreneurs. They were the kind of people I had once been, hopeful, a little scared, with more grit than polish. I told them not the spectacle of the courthouse, but the practicalities that had saved us. Keep your books, vet your partners, build an emergency fund, and most importantly, be generous in ways that preserve dignity. Never let the world define your worth by the size of their applause, I told them, the line a small echo of my grandmother. Let your worth be the sum of the ways you keep others steady. Afterwards, a dozen of them came up and said thank you. One woman gripped my hand like she was holding on to something precious. Another asked, in a voice that reminded me of me at 24, "How did you know when to act?" I told her what Naomi and Rebecca had told me. You act when you have proof, and when your action protects people rather than punishes a slap in the dark. We started a formal scholarship fund later that year in my grandmother's name, a modest endowment, but one meant to do what charity often fails to do, be ongoing, predictable, and dignified. Nicole graduated with her nursing degree the following spring, a cap and gown and a small group of Monarch staff beaming in the front row, like family, because in many ways we were. People would ask me if I regretted anything in the arc that led from that muttered insult in a ballroom to the arrest of a family who had pretended to be what they were not. Regret is complicated. I regretted that my mother had been hurt and that my brother had been deceived. I regretted that people felt compelled to perform wealth in a city where that performance too often replaces substance. I did not regret the methodical way we revealed the truth. The restraint mattered. The legal process mattered. There is a kind of humility that comes from owning a place people trust. It is not about controlling narratives. It is about ensuring that the fight for truth is transferred to those trained for it when necessary. Agent Reeves and her team did the arrest. Naomi and Rebecca did the careful, boring work of evidence. Wesley and the staff preserved the integrity of the space. I did not do anything noble so much as what was required of someone who had the means, the knowledge, and the moral imperative to act. Perhaps that is the point. Quiet competence, applied responsibly, can do more than a shout. People sometimes say, in the flat glare of social media, that the quiet ones are cowed. That isn't often true. Quietness is not the absence of strength. It can be its shelter. I had been underestimated for years, and I used that underestimation as an advantage. I did not expose the Whitmores to humiliate. I exposed them to protect. I did not want revenge. I wanted restitution, safety, and a path for my family to accept truth without the need for spectacle. At the year mark, we held a small, private event at the Monarch for staff and their families. Nicole spoke. Wesley joked about balance sheets, like a man taking the stage after many years in a basement office. My mother sat in the back, hands folded, and when she caught my eye, there was a softness there that had not been present before. Garrett came up to me afterwards, awkward and steady. "Thank you," he said. I smiled, because gratitude and apology sometimes arrive as companions. I keep my grandmother's necklace on a chain near the back of my office when I'm working late. It is small and scratched, and it smells faintly of a perfume that is impossible to fully remember. It is a talisman of the kind of endurance that does not need an audience. When I catch its glint as I move through a ledger, I think of the girl who left town with $200 and a head full of plans. I think of the nights I ironed sheets to the point of exhaustion, and the mornings I stood barefoot on cold floorboards thinking about what dignity looks like when it is baked into your work. Owning a room means you can set the terms of a conversation, yes, but it also means you inherit responsibilities that have nothing to do with titles.
It means tending, quietly and persistently, to the people who place their trust in you. It means knowing when to pull in legal folks, when to let investigators do their work, and when to open a door for someone who needs a hand. If you remember anything from this, remember that being underestimated can be a resource. Let your work speak, yes, but be prepared to make your work accountable. Protect the people you love. Use whatever access you have to build institutions that can outlast the small cruelties of any individual. If the story moved you, leave a comment about a time you were underestimated and what you did with it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe. Thanks for listening.